Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. And once again, this opportunity, privilege that EWTN gives me to sit with a guest to hear his journey of faith. I have a unique experience that I often don't have for a variety of reasons, but our guest tonight, Toby Cook, is a professional at what I'm an amateur of. He's been in, how long in television radio have you been in?
I was in 15 years where I got paid, and about 10 years before that where I fooled around in high school and college.
Well, Toby Cook, former Lutheran, welcome to The Journey Home, my friend.
Thank you, Marcus.
It's good to have you here.
Great to be here.
You're the Vice President of Publicity for the Kansas City Royals.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to hear about that too. You get to bump elbows with some of those guys out there with baseball bats in their hands.
Yeah, and you got to be careful because they've got baseball bats in their hands. They're swinging it around. Now, I went to work for the Royals 13 years ago after a broadcast career that started at a small TV station in Kansas, went on to Lynchburg, Virginia, home of Jerry Falwell.
There you go.
And Liberty University, and I was at the ABC affiliate there, and then I spent 9 years at the Fox affiliate in Kansas City before going to work for the Royals in 2006.
Before we get to the story, were you always doing sports?
I was doing sports a little bit, and then at one point I thought, I got really exposed quickly. I'd be around all these sports guys in the press boxes, and they know who the third string cornerback was at Iowa State, and I barely know who the starters were. And I was a little bit more into history and politics and current events, and so I switched over into news. But my job now is to promote a Major League Baseball team.
All right. Well, it's good to have you here.
Thank you.
It's a great privilege. So let me back out and invite you to start us off way back in your journey.
Well, I was born in 1967 in a small town south of Wichita, Kansas, Winfield. And my dad was a professor at a small school that was operated by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Mm-hmm. Now, many of your viewers, I know, probably are familiar with the LCMS, and you certainly are. It's the second largest Lutheran body in the United States, and it's the more conservative of the two big Lutheran bodies. The school doesn't exist anymore. They folded out some of the schools, but he was a teacher and my mom was a student, which was not terribly scandalous because they didn't have classes together, I don't think, but it was love at first sight. They got married, had 4 kiddos. I was the fourth of 4. And I grew up in another small town, Independence, Kansas, where my dad was an elementary school principal and my mom stayed at home with us. And we went to Zion Lutheran Church every Sunday of the year. If there was a reason for us not to go to church, it was because somebody was pretty sick. Or we were out of town and they didn't even want to use a travel exemption, if you can call it that. I mean, we went to church every Sunday. And it was a part of a wonderful growing up time. Independence was kind of a Norman Rockwell type of town in southeast Kansas, a beautiful downtown. The folks in town were hospitable and they were hardworking, and they, your 4th grade teacher or the person at the post office you would see at church and vice versa. And it was a wonderful growing up.
So I don't mean to interrupt you, but when you said that the Missouri Synod was the more conservative large body, just for our audience, conservative Missouri Synod does not mean more Catholic-like.
Right.
It means more Lutheran.
And more conservative in the social stances and in how they depict Scripture. So the other main body in the United States, which my brother belongs to, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA, was a merger back in 1986 of several Lutheran bodies. And
the LCA, which I brought up, and the American Lutheran Church into the ELCA.
And this is very much a mainline Protestant denomination. At 1.5 million people, a lot like Presbyterians and Methodists and the Episcopal Church USA in terms of where they sat, both on the theological spectrum and also kind of what they offered up to the United States in terms of Christendom. The Missouri Synod was smaller, but it was more conservative in the sense that they've always been pro-life. They were strong on traditional marriage. They only ordain men, which is unlike most Protestant churches, but many Southern Baptist churches, and the LCMS only ordains men. Stained glass windows, the clergy dress similarly to Catholics. When Martin Luther kicked off the Protestant Reformation, he didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. As you've talked about many, many times, but from a very practical standpoint, when I went to church on Sunday morning and I had a Catholic friend go along, they recognized a lot of it.
Yep.
There were differences. What I call the Catholic distinctives, Mary, Purgatory, and the Pope, they weren't there, but it was pretty similar.
Yep. I remember I grew up with what was called the Red Book.
Yes.
The Red Hymnal. I can still sing the songs from the Lutheran Mass, if you will. But yeah, Mary and all that, even though we had a statue of Jesus there in front, there's a statue in the church, but it was very conservative.
I wasn't going to do this, but you almost invited me to, because those songs have banged around in my head for years. The "Create in me a clean heart, O God," or right after, was it right after the gospel? "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace." Simeon saying, "My eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all Israel." And so when I got around liturgical traditions, Episcopal friends, even Catholic weddings, because I didn't step in a Catholic church when I was younger, and I had no desire to do that, but I wasn't weirded out by it because it was familiar. It was familiar from that Lutheran upbringing. So I grew up, thought about church on Sunday, thought about my favorite baseball team, the Kansas City Royals, thought about girls, thought about activities all around town. I had a cordial relationship with God. I was appreciative that there was a God who created me and loved me on paper, and I kind of sort of believed it. There was a moment when I was about 17 years old, like a lot of teenagers, where I started a search. Friend in town, his dad was the Episcopal priest. Other friends in town, they went to the Nazarene church and the Baptist church and Pentecostal churches. And the reason why this was important was because of confirmation class. Lutherans are confirmed at 13 and 14 years old a lot of times. And some of them take their first communion at age 7 or 8, but a lot of them wait until after they've gone through confirmation class. So we would have this confirmation class, and my evangelical friends, I didn't know the word at the time, but they would say, "What do you guys do at that confirmation class?" And I would say, "Well, it's kind of like a Bible study," because I didn't know how to explain it, and I really didn't want to explain it. The truth is that in confirmation class in the Lutheran Church, you learn from Luther's small catechism, which is part of the Lutheran confessions that the Lutherans say are the correct exposition of the scriptures. And what we learned was some very orthodox truths about Christianity that Catholics and Presbyterians and most of Christendom would agree with.
I remember it was the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Sacraments. I think those were the 4 sections of that small catechism. I had it too at age 13, right?
And our pastor would stand up there with a marker. Wasn't a chalkboard at that time, it was a marker, and he would put these 3 different sections down up on the marker, a whiteboard, if you will. And one of them was, "This is what the Catholics teach." And one of them was, "This is what the rest of Protestantism teaches." Right in the middle was, "This is what we teach and believe." A lot of similarities between the 3, but there were the Lutheran distinctives on their 2 sacraments, baptism and Holy Communion, on the fact that we don't have to work our way into heaven. We're saved by grace through faith. The Bible is the inerrant Word of God and is our only direction that we need to know for our salvation. And I always look back later and think, confirmation class, again, it was one night of the week, and I was probably thinking about a bunch of other stuff at the time, but there was a pretty good theme in it. This is confirmation class in the Lutheran Church. Why we're not Catholics. And then after that, small town, wonderful people. The Missouri Synod, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is salt of the earth. Some of the best people in the world. And small towns are filled with very, very good people, and they all got along. There wasn't an open hostility between the Catholics and the Lutherans and other denominations, but this was what I was starting to think of when I was a teenager. Well, another big thing happened to me when I was about 20 years old, and is I started dating this girl whose parents had all left the Catholic Church all at once. They were Catholic and they became Baptist. And they gave their life to the Lord and they were rebaptized, and I was as confused as I had ever been. And through the course of that relationship, really questioning my almost pseudo-Catholic belief system as a Lutheran, and I mean that as how somebody else would describe it. You know, we're often, Lutherans are always described as Catholic light, which is not correct, but it was I was confused, and I had to really fight through that. And at one point, the good thing that came out about that, Marcus, was that I had decided, you know what? Whatever I believe, if I say I believe this stuff, I'm going to live this way. And I developed a new zeal for my Christian faith.
Our guest is Toby Cook. You know, I was thinking the three categories that your confirmation pastor had put before you, that your friend and her former Catholic, now Baptist, rebaptized group, pulled you into that other section, looking at everything else from there. Well, if I'm not Catholic, well, why Lutheran? Because I have all these other views in this other, you know, and that really could undercut everything.
It did, because the next several years, it was a battle in my head. I want to talk and act like these good Christians who are not afraid to mention Jesus, who are not afraid to talk about Bible studies, who talk about growing in their faith. But there was something that was going on that wouldn't let me walk away from the LCMS. And so I stayed a Lutheran. And I tried to describe myself as a Lutheran with an evangelical flair, and I would defend Lutheranism to evangelicals, and that was a pretty tough road. I eventually went to Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, where my brother Ted was trained and later ordained as a Lutheran minister, and investigated whether God was calling me into the pastoral ministry. And I came away from that weekend convinced that God was not calling me into the pastoral ministry, and I went off and I did a 15-year TV career before I went to work for the Royals.
Concordia. Now, I might be wrong in my history, but I think that's where Newhouse and the gang went, right? Richard Newhouse, but there was also a division.
Yeah.
I remember at one point amongst the Missouri synods, and because some groups wanted to be almost more Catholic than the rest. Is that right?
Yes, 1974-ish, and I was about 6 or 7 years old, and it was called Seminex, Seminary in Exile. Now, my parents, having known each other at St. John's College in Winfield, Kansas, and the other synodical schools, ended up being pretty good friends with the people that were a part of the Lutheran power base in the 80s. And in the 70s, they would go to the every 3-year Lutheran convention, which was held in Indianapolis and Chicago and then St. Louis, and I think it stayed in St. Louis for a good many years. And they would talk about Seminex, and they would almost talk about it in, that really wasn't a real thing. It was a real thing. There were people that left the seminary and taught at a seminary in exile in downtown St. Louis, away from the other seminary. And it was one of the few instances in Christian American history where a liberal breakoff didn't survive, and the conservative base actually survived and became what the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was for many, many years.
Yeah. I remember reading about that myself on the outside. And when I looked back, it seemed that one of the questions they were battling over was the issue of being more Catholic in their liturgy, you know, in their rites and rituals. And a lot of the Lutherans saying, we're not going that far. We're not going that far. And I can't remember which side was on that split.
Yeah.
But I remember in reading Richard Newhouse's personal history, he was connected in a lot of that.
And what was important about it, and it's going to sound like symbolism and substance versus style, but when I went to Zion Lutheran when I was 4 and 5 and 9 and 12, I felt like I was entering into God's house. The way that we did things was certainly reverential, and the way that we dressed and comported ourselves, and the way that we sung those liturgies that I was talking about, I had a sense of sanctuary, which ended up being one of the main things that brought me into the Catholic Church after all of those struggles that I was telling you about, bouncing back and forth between my upbringing and my evangelical friends and all, was this idea that when we enter into the Holy of Holies, it's not supposed to feel and sound and look exactly like right before we entered. It's supposed to be different.
Yeah. I remember that too. My growing up a Lutheran, there was a big part of that. I know later, after I had left forever and then came back to Jesus and went back to my Lutheran, singing "Create in Me a Clean Heart, O God," and being driven to tears because of that was such a part of me. That's what you're talking about. That was the foundation for your faith.
Yeah.
You have a father who was an elder, Lutheran. You have a brother that became a pastor, and you became a TV guy. I mean, you know, I'm thinking, this idea of, Lord, what do you want me to do with my life? Was there a sense in which you were wondering that you weren't called to be a minister, you checked that out.
Yep.
Was there a sense so within you that, no, this is where my gifts are, this is how I can serve?
Without a doubt. And I think I had to go to investigate whether I was supposed to go do that. And part of it was because I just had the gift of gab. When I was 5 years old, my mom knew it. I was in plays and musicals all growing up. I was good in environments like that. And it just seemed like once I had checked that out, I really felt like God was saying, no, you need to go do this TV thing for a while. I think you're going to be okay at it, and I think you're going to have fun at it, and this is the path that that I'm going to send you on. And so I ended up working at 4 different television stations, 4 different markets, the last 9 years in Kansas City. And it was a blast. It was exhausting, because of the job that I have now with the Royals. We're at home, then we go on the road, and I don't travel with the team. So we put the pedal down, and we can ease it up a little bit, put the pedal down again. In television, it's all on all the time, from the moment you walk in the door until the moment you leave. And fun job. You're standing at the front row of things that other people don't ever get to see, but you also give up a lot. You give up a lot of sleep. You give a lot of time with your family. Maybe just doing some normal person things. But it was definitely something that I felt like God had called me to do as a vocation, just as much as what somebody would do if they were to follow the diaconate, the priesthood, or becoming a pastor.
Yeah, I led us in that discussion because I do think it's an important thing out there that every vocation we have is a witness. It is. Every vocation is to have a witness. And it's how we live that. How we live it, and then it gives the opportunity to talk about our faith. Now, as a TV guy, you're reading a prompter, but you had something to do with that prompter. In other words, what's on that prompter. It wasn't just handed to you. So sometimes you're called to say things that, well, is that according to my faith or not? Am I addressing it correctly? Am I covering was that ever a part of your journey during those years?
Without a doubt. Every single day. I'm a big fan, and I'm an old school journalism guy when it comes to, let's put this right down the middle as much as we can, and let's say, there are some things that happen. There's a fire that happens. There's a baseball game that happens. You report on that, and based on your editorial selection of what stories you're going to put on, you decide that people are going to care about that sort of thing. When it comes to issues, when it comes to phrasing them a certain way, and even story selection to an extent, I was a fan of having someone have no clue where I was coming from in my own personal life, except for when it came to stuff like the Royals and a festival that's happening in town, and it's okay to show that you think that it's really cool that we're having this festival in town, or that the Royals are on a 6-game winning streak. But I'm not a fan of what I call advocacy journalism, because I don't think it's journalism when the word advocacy is in front of it. We used to have a history in this country of what they called yellow journalism, where, even the newspapers were named after the Arizona Republic or the Gazette Democrat. I took pride in trying to tell the story so that the viewer or the listener could glean the information and then make a decision themselves on where they were going to go with it. And it was subtle, the way to do that. You would throw little things in that would kind of round it out. if this story that had been written by a producer 4 hours before that at 2 o'clock in the morning maybe sounded a little tilted one way, you could ad-lib a word or two to round it out. So you're respecting and showing the knowledge to your viewers that you realize that they're their own person.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It seems like that's what news ought to be.
Yeah.
And for those that think that today is the only brand new experience of newspapers leaning in one direction. Just go back to read about the 1800 election of Adams and Jefferson and the battle between the newspapers that was going on in Philadelphia and Baltimore. I mean, this has been a part of it, the struggle of saying what's true about this. What's true about this as opposed to a slant in it. And that's a real struggle. I mean, I would never be guilty of that in what I'm doing on this show. So, but in those 15 or so years of that, where was your faith?
I had a very interesting faith life in those years. I felt like a television newsroom was like going into battle every day. I felt like it was going into the lion's den. I don't know what it's like now because it's been 13 years since I was in a newsroom every day, but I felt like it was there. And yet, as I look back, I was the guy that came in with an obvious Christian faith, and this isn't a guarantee, but I just happened to be happily married and was starting a family. And the mores of others in the newsroom may not have been the way that I was, and I tried very much to respect where they were coming from and the choices that they were making. It was a very pluralistic situation, kind of like the military. And I felt like because I was doing as best I could on the air to be a good soldier, not advocating for my positions, playing nicely with others whom I might disagree with or have a kind of a different work relationship with. Honestly, I was given permission by most of them to kind of be my own guy away from the camera. I don't know if that's the way that it is now. I think that it's becoming harder and harder for a believer to be in the secular world because the secular world is getting more and more hostile. And I'm the kind of guy that, again, 15 years ago thought, well, we're overdoing that a little bit. It's not as bad as you think. Well, I don't know now because it just feels pretty hostile out there. It feels hostile to me, and I'm not in a newsroom anymore. I'm in a relatively safe environment where the Royals allow me to be a man of faith and a family man, and there really aren't any problems. But during that faith time, I was growing in my Lutheranism in the sense that I felt like I was being called to something. But what I was really doing was marching towards something I didn't know was going to be the Catholic Church.
Wow, because that wasn't on your horizon, I'm guessing.
No.
You know, you say you've been out of that for 10 years or so?
13 years.
13 years been out of that. And you really, think about even in the last 13 years, some of the major moral issues in our culture, lifestyle issues have so radically changed in those 10 to 13 years where in the days you were in there, just telling a story the way it is, today you can get trouble for just telling it unless you have a slant. Because if you don't have the accepted slant, well, you're being intolerant. I mean, it would be, I think it would be tougher in that environment.
It would be very difficult. I watched TV with a critical eye because I was in TV. Now, I say that, and then there were many, many years where I just didn't watch news. I got away from it after a while. But as I watch it with a critical eye, I can notice a few journalists where you can tell that they're trying. They're trying to have it the way that it kind of used to be, where you're at least acknowledging that there is a segment of the population that doesn't feel like the segment of the population in Washington, D.C. or New York. There are others all across the country, and they seem to be talking to them as well. But it's changing, you know. You have to watch very closely to see that.
Yeah, I could see that when the pressure rises in the newsroom. It's like, maybe I'll just be a weather guy.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, standing in front of a green screen and I'm looking over here, looking over there, and telling. Although the truth is that nowadays, even the weather guys, it isn't just about the weather. It's whether this stuff is happening is because of global warming. I mean, we got all this other politics slipping into the issue.
Yeah.
But you kept your faith during those years, is what you're saying.
I did. And it actually had strengthened, so much so that I spent 3 years in Lynchburg, Virginia, which was a fun town. I was at the ABC affiliate there. And Lynchburg was interesting because it was a lot of New York transplants. It was a lot of, pardon the phrase, blue bloods from Virginia, people from the South, farmers, not a ton of Catholics, but not a few amount of Catholics. We had one tiny little Lutheran church, Missouri Synod, one tiny LCMS church. So I was in church one day and I was noticing that in the bulletin, there was a guy by the name of Mr. Pete Fleshman. Like, Mr., what is that? Well, it turns out he wasn't a pastor. He was what they called a lay minister in Lynchburg because they had so few pastors that they started to ask guys in the congregation to stand up and serve as the pastor of the church. And you may know where this is going. I ended up the last year and a half that I was in Lynchburg basically serving as the spiritual leader of this small 50 or 60 person congregation in Lynchburg. And then when I moved to Kansas City, and this is part of why I was able to keep my faith, I think, I was still intrigued by this idea. Wow. And what I was really doing was I was trying to have it both ways. I don't want to go off and get to seminary and do all that studying, but I do want to be a part of the church, and I can get in front of people and talk, right? But I went through the Kansas District's lay ministry program. They called it the lay ministry deacon program. It's not an ordained position. It's what they call a credentialed position, where you would lead worship service for small churches that didn't have enough pastors. And in the course of that time, and this is where Rome started to really come into the possibility on the horizon, we started studying the church fathers, and we started studying church history. And I remember asking a question once, and it wasn't rhetorical. I wanted to know the answer. Who picked the books of the Bible? And it was difficult for them to answer. And when I got the answer, I was surprised.
That's a great place to take middle break right there, because you ended us with that question, which is, I love it. You've watched the program before, and you know that that's a common question that arises in so many people's lives. Early church fathers, who chose the books in the Bible. I mean, it's a key question, and I think it comes about by grace if somebody wanted to go closer to their Lord. So let's take a pause there, Toby. We'll come back in just a moment with more of Toby Cook's story. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our special guest today is Toby Cook, former Lutheran, and I've so rudely interrupted his journey by taking a break. But before we get back, I just want to remind you all that if there's somebody watching that's on the journey, especially if you're in ministry, and you're feeling the tugs that Toby was going to talk about here and the issues that he's talking about, if you're there, please contact us. Go to our website, chnetwork.org. Lots of other conversion stories. We have an online community, and we have lots of resources to help you work through all the different opinions out there. Toby was talking about, here's the one view, and here's the other view, and here's the Catholic view. The resources there to help you get drawn into the fullness of the church. So that's chnetwork.org. All right, Toby. So you're thinking about becoming a deacon, and so you're pastoring little churches, right?
And I did that for a glorious 18 months. Which was about the amount of time, maybe a little less than that I did in Lynchburg in Kansas City. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, the opportunity came to go to work for my favorite baseball team. And if I were to start this story all over again, I could say that my dad took me to my first Royals game in 1976. And it was really the first day on my journey to the Catholic Church, because I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that I went to work for the Royals because I was supposed to become Catholic. And I got a 13-year-old job out of it because of it, and we won the World Series in 2015. So there were some pluses to it in addition to finding Holy Mother Church. So I came to work for the Royals in 2006, and the team was historically bad at the time. They were losing so many games in 2005 and 2006. They brought in a general manager by the name of Dayton Moore, who's a wonderful Christian man, and he transformed the baseball team. And we slogged through a lot of years of these guys coming up through the minors all together, but they were all good together. And then in about 2013, we started winning more games than we were losing. And then we went to the World Series against all odds in 2015, had the tying run at third with 2 outs in the 9th inning of Game 7 and lost to the San Francisco Giants. And teams are not supposed to go back to the World Series, right, but we had to because we were that close. And sure enough, we led the league basically the entire 2015 season and won the championship in 2015, and it was so much fun. Well, after I started with the Royals, there was a seminal moment that happened for me in my faith journey. It was about 5 weeks after, and a guy named Mike Sweeney, who is a 5-time All-Star, he speaks all over the country to Catholic kids and Catholic groups. He is, in terms of the Catholic athletic world in the United States, all roads lead to Mike Sweeney. Everybody knows him. And Mike and I got to spend a year together at the Royals. And he told me later, there are no coincidences in life, Toby. You were doing this TV thing. I was going to get one more year with the Royals eventually because he had a contract extension years ago. And God put the two of us together for a year. That's a lot to hear from a kid that was a baseball fan and a baseball player saying that to him. Well, what Mike had done was he had asked the local bishop if he would say a mass at the stadium for players. Right now there are more than 25, really I think about 28 masses that are being said at the 30 Major League Baseball teams around. And we do ours on Sunday morning at 9:30 right there in the stadium. We have a couple of players come and then several of the staff. Well, I went to this mass out of respect for Mike, and so did a bunch of other people. Well, that was interesting. Months pass. You're going to think I'm making this story up right here. You're going to think that I'm blowing smoke because one of my bucket lists was to come to see Marcus Grodi and the Coming Home Network. Absolutely true. I was sitting in my office in February after I had started, and I was kind of searching. You know, it's not very busy sometimes in the off season, and I was kind of searching the internet. I thought, you know what? I've watched that show, The Journey Home, for years. I used to watch it as a non-Catholic. I watched it when I was a Lutheran for a lot of different reasons.
What'd you think of it watching it as a Lutheran?
I loved it, and I think it was the reason why I was marching closer and closer to Rome, because you were saying things that I wanted the Lutheran Church to be more of. I wanted it to offer that sanctuary. I wanted there to be a veneration, and we as Lutherans were finding it that, you know what, we're not going to get anywhere if we keep doing that old stodgy stuff. We got to do what our friends down the street are doing and have more contemporary music and have churches look more like other buildings. And it was breaking my heart.
Well, you kind of affirmed one of my goals in the journey home is to not be anti-Protestant.
Correct.
We're brothers in faith. I want to invite you all the way, but we're brothers in faith.
Yeah. And so I did a search and I found out that, wow, the Journey Home is a part of a bigger organization called the Coming Home Network. And there were these conversion stories on the Coming Home Network website. This was 2007. And I looked down the list of all these conversion stories, obviously people that you had on the show. And I picked out the one that was Missouri Synod Lutheran. Now, it was because of the way that it was titled. I could tell that Missouri Synod Lutheran had to have written that. It was a guy by the name of Todd Van Kampen out of Omaha. Yep. And I've talked to Todd since then. And he was a journalist before his wife was a Catholic, and he had gone to Denver in '93 for the World Youth Gathering.
Right.
And I read the story, and I was numb for 2 days. Because the things that Todd outlined in that conversion story were my story over the past 15 to 20 years. maybe more like 40 years. From the time that I had been baptized and raised and liked what I saw, then I was confused, then I bounced around in careers, then I tried my hand at lay ministry and the diaconate, and now I'm just some guy sitting here in a baseball stadium. And I started to read one Catholic conversion story after the next that summer of 2007. Rome Sweet Home by Scott Hahn first. How Firm a Foundation at some point in there. And then I was reading one day Crossing the Tiber by Steve Ray. And I hit a point where he described a friend who had called him and said, "Steve, I think I'm as Catholic as you can be in my head." And he said, "Well, why don't you go try to go to Mass? Let's do the real thing." And I said to my wife, "I got to go to Mass." And she said, "Go."
I was wondering where she's at in all this, Jerry.
4 years before that, she would have been like, "You want to do what?" You know, she grew up in a Disciples of Christ home, nominal Christian upbringing in terms of her friends and family and the dynamic that it had in her life. She had a little bit of a spiritual awakening like I did around college, and she was involved in a Baptist group. We met, fell in love, got married. She became Lutheran for me, raised our kids in Lutheran schools. The LCMS has an outstanding parochial school system, by the way. It's the second largest in the U.S. behind the Catholics in terms of sectarian schools. And I said to her one day, this is a story about what somebody's witness can mean to somebody. I said, "Man, I wish we could be Catholics like the Sweeneys." And what I meant by that was, and that's the witness that somebody has. What I meant by that was, he's not afraid to talk about Jesus. He's not afraid to say how on fire he is in his faith, and he's Catholic. A couple of years before that, I had seen him coming out of a dugout, and I saw him cross himself. I'm like, that's crazy. Because I thought he was evangelical, non-denominational. Mike Sweeney just crossed himself. He must have got that from the Latin players, because they all cross themselves when they get into the batter's box. And it turns out he's Catholic. So Mike's there, and he's got this incredible witness. We're putting on this Mass, and for that summer of 2007, I'm listening to Catholic radio, and I'm going to Mass secretly, because I'm still a deacon in the Lutheran Church. And as I read that book and got to that point in Stephen Ray's book, and told Barbara, "I've got to go to Mass," she said, "Go." So I went. It was as beautiful as I thought it was going to be. I called a priest the next Monday and told him, "Father, I think I'm investigating whether God is calling me home to the Catholic Church." And he said, "Well, in 2 weeks, we're starting this thing called RCIA. 40 years, and I pull up 2 weeks shy of RCIA starting." And then the neat story in terms of us coming to the church was that I went to the first session. Barbara said, "I'm not with you there yet, but I respect what you want to do." I was going to go to Lutheran church on Saturday night and Mass on Sunday, or vice versa, for a while. And she saw all the materials and she said, "You know what, I might come next Sunday." Easter Vigil 2008, the whole family came in.
Wow.
Greatest thing that's ever happened to us.
Was Mike connecting with you at all during this time?
Yeah. He was my mentor and personal teacher in not only the Catholic faith, but how to carry yourself as a Catholic in the locker room environment. I mean, I don't hang out in the locker room, but I have to go in there occasionally for things. The out in front of 20 to 40,000 people environment, the going into a crowd and having everybody want your autograph and hero worshiping environment. He taught me a lot of things about the humility of just a Catholic husband and father trying to be some sort of a witness by just doing the next right thing.
Wow. Well, I'm honored that not only the Coming Home Network, but the Journey Home program had something to play, get you ready for this. It was all for you could be here.
Yeah, I know.
That's the whole reason, preparing for you this. You're Lutheran. I'm interested in how you look back and see your Lutheran faith specifically preparing you for the Catholic Church. in other words, as a real stepping stone that God was using to bring you home?
I always say that my television career, everything that I learned in my TV career, I could transfer over to my job as a PR guy for a Major League Baseball team. Every skill, from working super long hours to thinking off of your feet, to dealing with things all around the stadium that you didn't see coming 5 minutes ago. My Lutheran upbringing, everything about my Lutheran upbringing helped advise me being Catholic now. And I learned my devotion for the Holy Trinity from the Lutheran Church and the example that my parents gave me. I learned the absolute necessity to have my kids observe the Sabbath. What do you mean you don't want to go to church? We go to church at our house. We may not feel like it this Sunday, but we're going to church. I mean, it's non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Because it was non-negotiable with my family. To their everlasting credit, the church does a beautiful thing in honoring and lifting high the cross of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins, that you and I would be forever lost without the saving grace of what Jesus did on the cross. And they lifted it up, not in some vain glory, but in real glory for us to see. And they tell it in a way that, for the most part, most Roman Catholics could say amen to.
Yeah. Well, the Catholic Church teaches officially that our separated brethren today are not guilty for the schism that they've been born into. And so we can see where the grace works. And I believe the trajectory being, as John Paul said, home. And it's our job to bring them home in a loving way, which means accepting them as our brothers and sisters and celebrating what they do that is of the Lord and of grace. But we also want to bring them home.
We do.
We want to bring them home. And so hopefully, like a guy like Mike Sweeney, that they'll look at us and say, boy, I want to be like that, which is what you're saying you did with Mike Sweeney. Oh, we want to be like that. What a great witness that you would look at someone like that.
And you know, when I knew that it was real was a couple of years after Easter Vigil. There was a fairly quick moment into RCIA where I knew where this was heading. You reach a point, and I know that others have talked about it before, where you're in a no man's land. I'm no longer Protestant, but I'm not quite Catholic yet, but I knew where this was going. And I feel like God said to me, when I said to him, I want to be Catholic, he said, okay, let's do this. Now here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to break you down and I'm going to build you back up. And a lot of the things that I had struggled with as a Protestant, especially as somebody that was seeking this lay ministry and this deacon thing, I was pretty good at it because I can put two words together and I can stand in front of people and I'm not shy and, oh, you give such great sermons, Toby, and oh, you're so inspiring and all. And all it did was just, all it did was feed my ego. It did other things too. Maybe some people were blessed. When I came into the church, it was, you're going to be a Catholic husband and father. And we'll worry about that other stuff later. Since then, we've had a child with Down syndrome, which is not a burden. It's a blessing beyond belief. It's hard a lot of times, but it's more of a blessing than anything. It wasn't all completely rosy after we came into the church, but it's so much more real. And I've met some of the holiest people of my life since our conversion. And it's because I'm seeing them at a very human and frail and granular level in which they've taught me to actually rely on God's providence rather than just talk about it.
Yeah, I get a little nervous that we made such a big deal out of Mike Sweeney because, the book of Job is where God's meeting with the devil and the guy says, look at my guy down there, how great he is. And the devil says, let me have him for a while. And let's pray for Mike Sweeney, because if we mention his name, the battle might be starting in his life even as we speak. And the fact that you're on this program, the battle might, that's the reality of wanting to follow our Lord Jesus Christ, is that we also are inviting the battle. And that's why you said it wasn't all roses when you came in. There's a challenge. And sometimes the challenge is that the church you find in reality isn't always what it looks like on paper. Did you find any of that when you came into the church?
Yes. I used to dismiss the Catholic Church. I was so full of myself when I would say this. It was so sanctimonious, but I would say, I find the Catholic Church to be the most fascinating and infuriating organization in the world. Well, and I look back on it now and just roll my eyes. Still fascinating, might be infuriating in certain places. The first wave of the priest sex abuse scandal hit when I was a Protestant, and I probably just dismissed that as in, well, that's because they only ordain celibates and they got to get their act together. And the big one hit since I've been a Catholic, and I don't know, there's some sort of a grace that I think many of us have right now where we feel almost steeled up for the battle. You're right, this is horrific. We're going to fight it within. We're going to take this fight because we're not just going to stand around anymore. And it's interesting to have seen it on this side of it. But if you base everything on the people that you have made out to heroes, you are going to be disappointed because of the sinful nature of every person. By and large, though, it's been the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced.
Yeah. What would you say? Okay, so coming from Lutheranism and Calvinism, there's some obvious inroads. Many parallels, both theologically, liturgically, ritually, but there's also some barriers. What about the barriers that you had to get over to become Catholic? I think one of them probably was Our Lady.
Without a doubt.
For you. And even some of the sacraments. How'd you get over those barriers?
I brought them up a lot in RCIA. And I remember one time, because I still think that Mary, Purgatory, and the Pope are where it's at in terms of our Protestant brothers and sisters thinking, he's a really good person, and I like some of the things that the Catholic Church is doing, and I've liked a couple of their popes, but I can't get this part. When it came to, I had one practical idea in mind where I had sort of reoriented things. And I did mean to talk about a couple of theological issues, and I'll say it all in this one answer. This isn't just about baseball, and this isn't just some cool story about a TV guy coming into baseball. It was Martin Luther's two pillars of the Protestant Reformation, sola scriptura and sola fide. Faith alone and Scripture alone, the 66 books of the Protestant Bible telling us exactly what the faith is. And seeing those things oriented through a Catholic perspective made me realize that we not only don't have as big of a disagreement as we sometimes think we do, but orienting it, having the glasses on as a Catholic, helped me to understand it. As I've said before, very, very simply, when it comes to this whole God, Jesus, and the Bible thing, how the Catholic Church presents it just has made so much more sense to me. But I did ask a question to our senior pastor, Monsignor Tom Tank, Ascension Parish, Overland Park, Kansas. I said, Father, I kind of get it, because I got the Eucharist pretty quickly. But some of this other stuff, is it okay for me right now to just rest on authority and trust in the church's authority until I can work some of this out? And I'll never forget his answer. He said, oh, but if we would all do that for everything. Because a clear point that I got out of it is that when Jesus said to Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, he was saying that there will be an authority made up of a lot of people, not just Jesus and me, but a lot of these folks that were part of the salvation history that created the Holy Catholic Church and its authority to interpret.
Yeah.
And if I can trust that authority, believe me, it doesn't feel like a blind authority where I'm like, okay, whatever you tell me. Yeah. That was how I was able to take care of some of the difficulties that I was having.
Yeah, for me, what I found was, here I am, and here's this thing that I just don't get. And the idea is, trust the church that this is true. And what I found that by doing that, it helps straighten up a lot of the things between here and there to make sense, so that then, now I see it. Because it put a lot of things in line. For example, devotion to Our Lady. I don't get that. Well, actually, what I have to understand first is that I can pray to ask any saint. So before devotion to Our Lady, we just got to have the whole idea of communion of saints.
Correct.
In foundation before I could even understand the Marian thing. And even that wasn't a part of my Lutheranism or my Presbyterianism, that the whole idea of communion of saints. Do I talk to anybody after they've gone? Once I can accept that veil is very thin, then it opens the door for all those other things. But you had to get over too, in that whole journey for you. Wow, we only got 4 minutes. You bumped elbows with a lot of Christian baseball players. Do they see their vocation as a witness to God?
Yes. Those that wear their faith on their sleeve. Sweeney was the best example. There are a couple of guys on the team right now who are Catholic and go to Mass. Literally, if we could have a third of the Latin players who may have grown up in a Catholic environment go, our rooms would be full. And there's a large contingent of evangelicals. And at that point, I'm back to, these are my brothers in Christ. And they're showing some sort of stance beyond their extraordinary physical skill to be able to play a game that very few other people could at that high of a level. They're taking that and saying, you know what, whether I like it or not, I've been given a platform. And if I can do the Lord's work and be an example to others, then I'm going to do it. And I've seen it time and again. I've seen it time and again across Major League Baseball. I'm thinking of a guy named Ian Kennedy who's pitched for the Royals the last several years, who he isn't in your face. He's a good Christian man. He's trying to have as many kids as Mike Sweeney, who now has 6, and I think that Ian has 6 as a Protestant. And he is in the trenches day after week after month with people that are in need in Kansas City. And he does it by his Christian faith and love. And if no television camera that was coming because me, the PR guy, wanted it to be there, he would do it anyway.
Yeah. I suppose a part of that is beginning with recognizing that his ability to hit a baseball or to throw a baseball is a gift of God.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to begin there. If they see it as me, then it undercuts everything else.
Yeah.
But if you begin by recognizing it's a gift of God, because scientifically we're not supposed to be able to hit a baseball with a bat, right?
No. And at 99 miles per hour, at 60 feet 6 inches, we're on the edge of physics of it actually being able to happen now. If anybody gets up to 109 or 110 consistently, you won't be able to hit it anymore. So baseball's a miracle too, Marcus.
Well, I know it is. It's a great joy. We've got a minute or so, Toby.
Yep.
If a guy's watching, Lutherans watching, majority Synod Lutherans watching, and they're wondering, why should they make the same journey home you've made, my friend?
What the Lutheran Church has taught is an unwavering devotion toward God the Father who created us, God the Son who sanctifies us, God the Holy Spirit who is with us today. And the Church has also taught that there are sacred texts that tell the story about not only Jesus, but about the way that we can live. I had found that for a long time. When I found the sanctuary of something that was bigger and brighter and bolder than anything that I had imagined, I came into the Catholic Church. I don't think that it's kicking dust on Lutheranism. I think that it's honoring your Lutheran background to at least consider Rome, crossing the Tiber.
Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you for joining us on the program, sharing your journey, and Lord bless you in all that you're doing.
You as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Toby's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.